Hello and welcome back. You are officially off the Deaton path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of November 21st, 2024. We are recording this week from the beloved Community Department here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House, overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest this week is historian and journalist David Greenberg. David is a professor of history and of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and he is a frequent commentator in the national news media on contemporary politics and public affairs. He specializes in American political and cultural history. David earned a BA in history from Yale University, a master's in history, a master's in philosophy, and a PhD in history, all from Columbia University. Formerly a full-time journalist, David is a contributing editor to Politico magazine, where he writes a regular column. He previously served as managing editor and acting editor of The New Republic, and later a contributing editor. Early in his career, he was the assistant to author Bob Woodward on the book entitled The Agenda, Inside the Clinton White House, published by Simon Schuster in 1994. At Slate, he pioneered the History Lesson column, the first column by a professional historian to regularly analyze current affairs in light of their history. He has also written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, and many other scholarly and popular publications. David's first book was entitled Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image, published by W.W. Norton in 2003, which won the Washington Monthly Annual Political Book Award, the American Journalism History Award, and Columbia University's Bancroft Dissertation Award. He then published a biography of our 30th president entitled Calvin Coolidge, published by Henry Holt in 2006, a volume in the Distinguished American Presidents series, which appeared on the Washington Post list of best books of 2007. He is also the author of a book entitled Republic of Spin, an inside history of the American presidency, published by W.W. Norton in 2016, which won multiple awards, including the Goldsmith Book Prize from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He also served as editor of a book entitled Presidential Doodles, 2 Centuries of Scribbles, Scratches, Squiggles, and Scrawls from the Oval Office, published by Basic Books in 2006, and as co-editor of a book entitled Alan Brinkley, A Life in History, published by Columbia University Press in 2019. His latest book, and the one he is here to talk about with me today, is entitled John Lewis, A Life, published on October 8th of this year by Simon & Schuster, a cradle-to-grave biography of the civil rights icon and the longtime congressman from Georgia. It was reviewed in the New York Times on October 4th and in the New Yorker on October 7th. And I can tell you without reservation, it is a tour de force and is bound to be a prize winner. My conversation with David Greenberg begins now. David Greenberg, welcome to our podcast.
I'm glad to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, you have written a biography of John Lewis. Your previous work focused on presidential history in some way. You are not only a historian, but you are a professor of journalism. So how did you leapfrog over, or was it a leapfrog, over to John Lewis? How did you get interested in such a big subject?
Yeah, well, I did not feel it was such a leap. I'd always written broadly about American politics and the American past. I had focused in my books, it's true, on presidents, but I'd written about the parties and liberalism and conservatism and Congress and the Supreme Court, the whole great American pageant. And, you know, we were in the middle of Donald Trump's first presidency, and here was John Lewis, now an elder statesman of the Democratic Party and increasingly recognized as the conscience of the Congress, as he was called. And it occurred to me there was no biography of John Lewis. And in all my books and writing about American politics and history, I had actually not written a book in which the story of race and racism and our struggle to overcome it was central to the book. And it is a theme that is central to American history. And so it occurred to me that this would be a way not only to produce a biography of a man who very much warranted one, but also to tackle some of these difficult questions that have, plagued our country from the founding.
We're going to talk about a lot of things, John Lewis, in this interview. For those people listening who may not remember, first of all, he was an important, he was not a, he didn't really affiliate with Georgia until later in his life. He was born in Alabama. But those of us who remember, he served the 5th District of Georgia for many years as a congressman. So he's an important historical figure in this state. He died in July 2020. And I noted that you said in your introduction and in your acknowledgments that you were able to talk to John Lewis himself. He knew you were writing this biography. Is that correct?
That's right. I had the privilege of meeting with him. I thought it would be, well, to our mutual advantage if he gave me his blessing to write this book. And in some ways, the hardest part was just getting the initial appointment to see him. But I came down to Atlanta. We were kind of at peak John Lewis, by which I mean the week before he had done the Super Bowl coin toss with Andrew Young while when the game was in Atlanta. And the day after I met with him, he flew out to Los Angeles to appear at the Oscars, where he introduced Green Book, the winning Best Picture. So here I had gotten wedged in between these two iconic American events, both of which, chose to feature John Lewis that year. So he was in great demand, but we sat down and had a very sort of simple, straightforward conversation. He supported my writing the book, and his chief of staff, longtime chief of staff, a wonderful guy named Michael Collins, was supportive, helped, open doors, get people to agree to talk to me and, make things available. So it was a positive experience. Very sadly, of course, people know later that year in 2019, he announced that they had discovered pancreatic cancer, and within another 7, 8 months, he passed away. I did have a couple additional phone interviews with him during the pandemic. He was getting cancer treatments. I couldn't very well go visit him, but we did talk on the phone a few times. But beyond talking to him, I talked to hundreds of colleagues, friends, family members, people who knew him in one context or another. I worked in dozens of archives, went through thousands of newspaper clippings. So there's really a very rich and diverse base of research materials, both human and documents, that informed my understanding of John Lewis over 5 years of writing this book.
Mm-hmm. Did he ask you the question that I just asked, which is, how did you get interested in writing his life? Did he ask you that, or did he just accept that, of course, you're interested in his life? You're a historian.
Yeah, he did not ask that. I think, he's a very self-effacing person, and I think he obviously came to accept, he lived, by the end of his life, was kind of this enormous celebrity where just, walking down the street, and I have some accounts of this in the book that are very funny from some of his aides. One of his aides says she looks over in the window of a Quiznos and sort of sees a guy like drop his sandwich as John Lewis walks by and run out into the street. I mean, that kind of thing, people going up to him at airports and restaurants and just, I mean, it was almost religious, like they wanted to touch the hem of his garment,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and he had that effect on people. So I think, yeah, for him, he probably accepted. It was not a surprise that here was a historian who thought it worthy of writing his life.
You make the reader across all of the pages of this book from his very humble birth, and we'll talk about that. You really portray him as a man. I mean, you hear this a lot of the people. He was comfortable around people. He liked people. But he did almost give off, it seemed like, this almost saint-like aura when you were in his presence. Did you feel that at all?
You definitely feel it. I definitely felt it. And I'm not a religious person, but I kept reaching for, thinking about these religious metaphors. I mean, all the same, I really have tried in this book, and I hope succeeded, at showing him to be human. I say he was saintly, but not a saint.
Hmm.
On the one hand, he had certain qualities that I think very few of us could claim to have. The sheer courage walking into physical danger, even likely death, when
Hmm.
he approached whether George Wallace's state troopers at Selma on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or confronting these angry mobs who assaulted the Freedom Riders back in 1961. He
Hmm.
really nearly gave his life, and did it with a kind of equanimity and uh, almost serenity that, again, I think few of us could imagine mustering. But at the same time, he's a person. I show him to have done things he later regretted, to have made mistakes, to have made friends feel bad. It's not all an entirely positive portrait, although certainly the overall picture one takes away of the man is an admiring one, and of a man who did great things and led a great life.
You had the unenviable task when you choose someone who has died so recently and was so prominent. You not only did a huge amount of archival research in what we think of as traditional paper sources, but you also you interviewed, presumably either in person or on the phone or by Zoom, a lot of people. There is an entire page jam packed with names in the back of your book, and they are some very famous people. Can you talk for a moment about what that was like?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned before, I was a journalist before becoming a PhD historian. And, in most of my other books, I had not really exercised those journalism muscles. But in this one, partly because, especially for the recent period, and by recent, historians mean like since the 80s, there just wasn't as much paper available. I mean, there are newspapers, but the archival material wasn't there. So you go to interviews, they were especially useful on that score. And, I interviewed people who were on his staff. I interviewed one of his doctors, his interior designer, people who worked for him in different capacities. I interviewed President Obama, President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi. People wanted to talk about John Lewis. They felt warmly toward him. They felt he was important, and his story was an important one to tell. So, although sometimes with the big names, it took some work to get those appointments. Um, in other ways, it was kind of remarkably easy, and I was sort of surprised sometimes at the readiness and willingness of certain prominent people to, yeah, sit down with me or get on the phone with me and talk for half hour, sometimes for 3 hours, and tell stories, share their memories, share their understandings of John Lewis.
He was particularly close, I think, to President Bill Clinton. That certainly comes across in your book. He famously, of course, supported Hillary Clinton right up until the very end, and until he didn't, when he
Right.
supported Barack Obama. But what was it like to talk to Bill Clinton about John Lewis?
That was really an amazing interview. You could tell Bill Clinton still feels first indebted to John Lewis. Um, John Lewis, people don't remember this. Sort of played the role for Bill Clinton in 1992 that Jim Clyburn played for Joe Biden in 2020. That is to say, Lewis, along with Andrew Young and Maynard Jackson and some other important Atlanta African American leaders, really helped deliver Atlanta and Georgia for Bill Clinton in the 1992 primaries. It was the first primary that Bill Clinton won. People think of New Hampshire and the comeback kid, but Clinton had very cleverly called himself the comeback kid after coming in second in New Hampshire. And he didn't win a primary till Georgia. But Clinton ended up running away with a black vote throughout the Democratic primaries, and that was the main reason that he sewed up that nomination. But he also was a friend of John Lewis, and that came through in the interview. Um, Clinton, I went up to his office in Harlem. He keeps an office there, and we sat for an hour. He could have kept talking if his aide hadn't said, Mr. President, our time is up. And I would ask him, I found a little squib in, I think, USA Today about a 1994 visit that John Lewis made to the White House after having been to South Africa around the time of the first ever truly democratic elections there. And I asked Clinton about it. He said, "Oh, yeah, I remember that visit. I know what I wanted to find out from him." Amazing recall. He wanted to understand the violence that was happening in South Africa and whether it was going to derail the elections where Mandela was, of course, ultimately chosen as president. So, yeah, he was effusive. He had a great memory, and so too were Secretary Clinton, President Obama. Something about John Lewis triggered in people, not only vivid memories, but an enthusiasm about talking about him.
It's a remarkable journey. He was born in rural, I believe, was it Troy, Alabama? Was that where he was from in
Yeah.
1940? And I'll talk about that. The periods of his life, it seemed to me, the breakdown is, obviously the period of his youth in Alabama. He became a student, and then he became a civil rights marcher, worker, organizer. He then moved into, beginning in the 70s, I think, public life, what we would think about as public life, and ran for Congress in 1986. And from that point on, he was a congressman. He became, as you said, this moral voice that really I don't believe anybody plays that role anymore. In part because this was the guy, as you said, who got his brains beat in many times in the name of voting and in freedom. And there's really nobody after he died to sort of step into that role. Is there?
I'm hard pressed to find one. I mean, we certainly can probably think of people in public life who've done heroic things, and who we can admire for their courage, whether in battle, or other valor. Certainly, there are some other living legends, still from the civil rights years. Andrew Young is still alive and well, and several others. But yeah, Lewis enjoyed a unique position in
Mm-hmm.
his final years. It
Mm-hmm.
was interesting because the heroism of those early years, say from the 1960 sit-ins, where he was a leader in the Nashville group that was one of the most successful student groups to desegregate lunch counters, in 1960, to the Freedom Rides, where he's also a leader desegregating interstate bus travel and bus stations throughout the South, all the way through Selma, which was the March for Voting Rights. you know, and all of that was known and pretty public. And yet, as you say, for many decades after that, he doesn't go into obscurity, but he's certainly not a national celebrity. And there are other people, including his best friend Julian Bond, who are far more famous. And Julian Bond is the one who's doing movies with Sidney Poitier, who's hosting Saturday Night Live. And John Lewis is now, he's a guy running the voter education project, getting people to register to vote across the South, or he's on the Atlanta City Council. And it's only later in life that there's this kind of renewed attention to all that he did. And it's partly because, as a long-serving US congressman, he has that profile. And, as people get older and become sort of fixtures on the scene, we begin to kind of credit this long life of, achievement. And so in a weird way, it's not until fairly late in life that he gets kind of full credit and full appreciation of even those things he did when he was young.
So let's go back to his birth in Alabama. He grew up one of many children to farmers. He grew up in an agricultural environment, um, and I think you can trace his lifelong humility to that. Right? He came from poverty. He did not get a really great education as a young man, in part because of segregation, funding for black schools in Alabama. He stuttered, and as we know, all of his life, he was extremely conscious of his own voice and the way it sounded and the fact that it made him sound less intelligent than he was. I think people all of his life underestimated his intelligence and everything else about him. So tell us about the circumstances that created this remarkable man.
Yeah, very true. I mean, he did grow up in pretty stark poverty. He called it a shotgun house. You could, open one door and shoot a gun through, go out the back door.
Is it still there?
Well, they've rebuilt the house, but
Okay.
the property is still there, and he has
Hmm.
family who still live on the same
Hmm.
property outside of Troy, Alabama. And the no running water and outhouses. And until he got to college, he not only never had a bedroom of his own, he never had a bed of his own. He always shared a bed with one or two of his brothers.
Hmm.
I mean, it's that level of poverty. And they all worked hard on the farm. All the kids had to pitch in. Lewis hated the work. He was not meant for the farm. He figured it out pretty early. There were days where his parents made the kids stay home from school to help. It was harvest season. They were needed to pick cotton or peanuts or corn. John Lewis, you say he was underestimated as an intellect, which is definitely true. Voracious reader as a child. In college, he's reading philosophy and theology. Definitely a good mind. And as a boy, these days he was supposed to stay home on the farm, he would get his book bag ready and hide under the front porch. And when the bus pulled up, he would dart out and get on the bus and go to school. So some kids trick their parents so they could skip school. John Lewis did the exact opposite. He knew he wanted out of this life. He did not see it as a way for his parents to get ahead. They were kind of treading water, making enough to support the family, but not much more. He also, of course, hated the living under the boot of segregation, which he just instinctively knew as a young boy was wrong, was evil, was unjust. At one point, an uncle takes him up to Buffalo, where the family has relatives, and he sees a very different life. I mean, Buffalo isn't free of racism, but it's a different life for Black people. They can ride the bus next to white people. They have neighbors who are white people. They interact. They're often friendly to each other. It's just a different world. And so he understands. He wants to get out of the farm. He wants to bring an end or contribute in some way to help bringing an end to segregation and making a better life for his people. And this sets him off. So when he goes to college, and again, as a reader, as someone intellectually curious, he wants to go to college. His mother, who besides working the farm, also works as a domestic laborer and does wash in different institutions, she finds a brochure for a place called American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville. He writes away, applies. The letter comes, and I was able to get his college acceptance letters and all kinds of material from one source, a good friend who had been just collecting John Lewis's stuff for decades. And the letter says, "We hope it is part of God's plan for you to come study here." I don't know too many places that these days welcome kids with that kind of acceptance letter. Maybe Bible colleges do. But anyway, he goes off to Nashville, and there he falls in with a group of ministers who are, not just Baptist ministers, but believe in the social gospel and are applying the teachings of Christ kind of fused with Gandhian nonviolence in the manner of Martin Luther King to address social and political problems like segregation. And that's his real introduction to the movement.
And really, though he escaped the farm, he kind of took that with him the rest of his life because you make it a point to say wherever he was and whatever he was doing, he would stop and talk to janitors. He would stop and talk to people working
Yeah.
on things. He was comfortable with the domestic staff at a hotel. Whatever it was, he was at home with those people, and that really comes out of that Alabama upbringing.
Yeah.
Um,
One of his aides said to me, trying to explain him, like, you have to understand, deep down, he's still the little boy from the farm. And I think both of these qualities, the self-effacing, humble side of him, goes back to that, and also this equal treatment of everyone. Another chief of staff told me a story. They were late for an appointment with the Democratic Speaker of the House, and they go by the security guard at the Cannon office building where Lewis has his office, and the guy's got a question for Lewis, and he stops, and they're talking. The aide is tugging at the congressman's sleeve, and Lewis turns to him and he says, now, Rob, the speaker can wait. And, in John Lewis's eyes, this security guard was every bit as deserving of his time and attention as was the speaker. And it's just how he treated everyone. And it had to do also, I think, with his kind of universalist, both politically universalist and also Christian vision. Every one of God's creatures is kind of equally deserving and, has that spark of the divine. And nobody was going to, he wasn't going to put on airs or presume to be better than anyone.
So he goes to Nashville, and then that phase of his life begins. He's a student, and at first he's a seminary student, and he decides really doesn't want to be a preacher. So
Right.
what happens to him? This is in the late 50s. Is there a spark? Is there a thing that touches him or happens to him that pushes him on the road to become this civil rights person?
I
Because
think there are a number of things that are growing, that are germinating over many years. I mean, even
Mm.
in high school, he's 15, he hears Martin Luther King give a sermon on the radio and is captivated. He's following the Montgomery bus boycott, the effort to, desegregate or, equalize treatment on the Montgomery buses. Becomes this big national story. He follows all of this closely in the newspapers and on the radio. He even, as a boy, tries to petition, like he as a reader, he wants to get a library card from the public library and is denied because he's Black. So he organizes friends to petition the library to no avail. But again, so you see the roots of the activism even there. James Lawson, who was a divinity student at Vanderbilt in the late 50s, early 60s, who is really kind of one of the leaders of these Nashville ministers. I had the privilege of interviewing him too. He just died last summer at the age of 94. Lawson said that when he encountered Lewis, 19-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old Lewis, he was already ripe. That is, Lewis had all the conditions were there for him to be a part of this movement. So it was people like James Lawson, also a local minister named Kelly Miller Smith, who led the First Baptist church there in Nashville and who was a teacher at American Baptist Seminary. There are several figures who became mentors to John Lewis. But it was partly just being at the right place at the right time, because he fell in with them very naturally and quickly became enthusiastic about their ambitious plans to do a Montgomery bus boycott style action in Nashville. Took him a little while to figure out what they wanted to do, but eventually that's what became those lunch counter sit-ins.
How do you explain his where did his lifelong commitment to nonviolence? Did that come from just rubbing shoulders with Martin Luther King? Did he study Gandhi and Thoreau also? I mean, how did he, because he never gave that up.
Right. He felt it to the depth of his being. And this was something that James Lawson and many other ministers there, Metz Rollins, Andrew White, Kelly Miller Smith, they were all believers in this. In the literature on the civil rights movement, there's sometimes this picture of the students who come up through the sit-in movement are portrayed as at odds with King and these ministers. That may have been true in some places, not in Nashville. In Nashville, the students were very much proteges of these ministers, and the ministers were themselves affiliated with King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So James Lawson had them reading Gandhi. He had them reading Thoreau. He had them studying all kinds of historical examples of nonviolent resistance, nonviolent protest. And there's a lot of study and reading and discussion before they attempt any direct action, as it's called. So this Nashville group in particular is really steeped in the teachings. And, he's a college student. He's eager to read. He's eager to learn. I found his application to Fisk University because he's so enamored of the Nashville movement that even after he gets his degree from American Baptist, he wants to stay in town. So he figures I'll get another degree at Fisk. He applies for another BA. And in the application, what books have you read? He's talking about biographies of Kennedy and Nixon. So he's very much keeping up with current affairs, but he also is writing about Gandhi and, very much an influence on him.
And he you tell the story very well of his first meeting with Martin Luther King Jr. And he comes back to Alabama and meets, I think, with King and Ralph David Abernathy. There may have been one other person, I can't remember. And he wanted to try to get into, was it Alabama State?
Troy State, yeah.
Troy State, right, at Troy State. And they told him what would happen. Certainly you can try to do that, but they're going to come after your family. There's going to be violence. And he talks to his parents, and they don't want any part of that. It seemed like a very pivotal moment that he never lost his reverence for Martin Luther King Jr. He always, even when other people went off in a different direction of nonviolence, he maintained that loyalty. Whether he was present or not, he defended him and was always impressed with him as a disciple. Is it too strong to call him a disciple?
No, not at all. And, I don't think it's too strong to say that he idolized Martin Luther King from that early meeting. In a way, it was fortuitous that John Lewis's parents, said no to this plan to try to be the one to integrate Troy State, because he was not 21 yet, and in Alabama needed his parents' permission if they were going to sue for admission. But what happens as a result is he goes back to Nashville. This is, I think, after his freshman year. And that's precisely when things start heating up with, James Lawson and the group. So he goes from one sort of form of civil rights protest that doesn't quite get off the ground to another that very much does. And he stays in touch with King after that first meeting. And King is aware of him as an emerging leader in the Nashville group. And soon they're working closely. King invites him to be on the board of the SCLC because King is realizing he needs to work with this younger group of people who are coming up. And, as you say, a few years down the road, there are people in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who become disenchanted with nonviolence, who feel that different methods, tactics, philosophies are needed, but never Lewis. It's both his admiration for King personally and also his commitment to these ideas. It's not just loyalty to King, but both of those things kind of keep him on this path. And then to his dying day, he is reminding, the protesters of the summer of 2020 to stay true to the path of nonviolence. There was a great deal of nonviolent protest that summer. There was also violent protest. And John Lewis thought it was his role to kind of remind people which path to choose. So it was something he kept with him his whole life.
In Nashville, he led a series of sit-ins for lunch counters, restaurants, movie theaters, very public places that did not serve African Americans. And he certainly came into contact with hostile whites who not only threw epithets and names, but were sometimes violent. But his most famous, I think, and probably the two things that he is associated with where he literally put his life on the line was first the Freedom Rides in 1961, particularly when they arrived in Alabama. What was that experience like for him?
I mean, it's to sort of hear his accounts of it, and besides his memoir, he's gave some have amazingly detailed oral history accounts that I found in archives. Basically what had happened with the Freedom Rides is the initial group was people of all different ages, races, men and women, riding through the Upper South in an effort to force the government to uphold an existing Supreme Court ruling that said these facilities must be integrated. Lewis left the trip for just a couple of days to interview for a fellowship. He was about to graduate from American Baptist. And during that time, one of the buses was bombed. Basically, someone threw a Molotov cocktail and blew up the bus, and the riders were nearly killed. At that point, they suspended the Freedom Rides. Lewis, with his friends from Nashville, were upset that they said, no, this show must go on, and they revived it. So staffing them now with all these young Nashville students, they said, we're going to take buses into Alabama and continue the ride from Alabama to Mississippi, and ultimately they hope down to New Orleans. Well, on that attempt to revive the rides, they come into Montgomery, and they've had sort of police protection most of the way from Birmingham to Montgomery, but the jurisdiction changes as you get to the city limits. And under the Montgomery police, there was a decision to kind of go silent and let the local thugs and Klan members work their will. And John Lewis and his comrades get off the bus to be met with these stark raving mobs, people armed with baseball bats and garden tools and just anything they could find as a weapon, who are just beating these young men and women into submission, into unconsciousness. Lewis himself is badly injured, has to get medical treatment. He's smashed over the head with a Coca-Cola crate and kind of loses consciousness. Another friend of his, a guy named William Barbie, suffered permanent brain damage. I mean, people could have been killed. Even one of the people who Robert Kennedy sends down from the Justice Department, John Siegenthaler, sort of relatively well-known man, is hit with a lead pipe, his body rolled under a parked car. So this is incredibly ugly, brutal stuff. And yet, as soon as he's patched up and a day or two later, John Lewis is ready to get back on the bus and do the next leg and go into Jackson, Mississippi. And I think it may be his first national press conference, where he's there with King and James Farmer and some of the more prominent national civil rights leaders. And here he is, 21 years old. He says things like, I don't want to die. I love life. I don't want to die, but I'm prepared to die because it's a fight for these ideals that he believes in. And that kind of maturity, he's not doing this with his eyes closed. He's not doing this with some naive sense that, everything will work out. He's very aware that he could die at any point. It was just remarkable to encounter that.
Well, and to be clear, too, so much of the civil rights movement, particularly later, relied upon moving motion picture film that could be sent to TV stations and flashed across the nation so you could see the horrific things. There was nobody filming what happened at that bus station. There were photographs, I know, taken of John Lewis and Jim Zwerg, I believe, later when they had their heads bashed in, the blood all over their clothes. But they weren't doing this for the publicity. They literally were trying to desegregate a bus station, which, as you mentioned, interstate commerce, right? This is a federal Supreme Court case that supposedly those places could be integrated. And they were simply trying to go in and sit down and get coffee or get fed. And they were almost killed with no cameras rolling.
That's exactly right. And one thing that these mobs did actually was, before they attacked John Lewis and the riders, they attacked the reporters who were there and destroyed their cameras. Some of them did have cameras and tape recorders. So they beat them up first, and then they turned on the riders. And some people fled, ran away. Lewis was shouting directions to Ralph Abernathy's house, and here's how you get out of harm's way. But yeah, this was very much a mission of genuine conviction and belief, and one they felt they had to, pursue in order to see justice and the rule of law upheld.
And you think at that point, most people would have said, you know what, this is a lot bigger than me. I'm not,
Yeah,
this
I'm
is
out.
not, this is not, I mean, it's a war, but it's not one I am willing to die on this hill. And he never wavered. He kept going. Famously, 2 years later, he's involved in the March on Washington. And I think it's the first time that this humble, as you said, this young man from Troy met a president.
Yes. So in 1963, he's made chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There's sort of an unknown story of the Nashville desegregation, which I tell, I think, in the book, in its most complete form, at least involving John Lewis, that people sort of know about the 1960 lunch counter stuff, but for 2, 3 more years, Lewis is out there, sometimes with a very tiny rump group of his fellow protesters,
Mm-hmm.
pushing for desegregation. And they achieved some remarkable gains in the spring of 63 that are not fully credited because it's sort of simultaneous with the more famous Birmingham campaign that King and James Bevel and Fred Shuttlesworth lead in Birmingham. But this helps people realize, okay, John Lewis is someone who should be leading this new student organization called SNCC. So in that capacity, as the chairman, he suddenly finds himself invited to the White House as the March on Washington is being planned, as John F. Kennedy is unveiling his, first major civil rights bill, which becomes the 1964 Civil Rights Act eventually. And there's Lewis sitting around. I'm forgetting now if it's the Roosevelt room or the cabinet room, but one of the White House rooms with Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph and Roy Wilkins, all these titans of the movement. Lewis really doesn't say anything. He's humble enough to sit and listen and learn, and he's excited to be in the presence of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson's there, others are there. But it's his introduction to the idea that, you can make a difference through politics. If you can get the president's ear, if you can get the ear of influential people in government, you can make a difference. And I think it's the beginning of his interest in a Washington political career.
And the story you tell of his speech at the March on Washington, of course, we all know King's famous speech that ended it, but John Lewis spoke earlier in the day. And you tell it's kind of a riveting story about how it was for him, a very uncharacteristically martial speech. He was saying, we're not going to take this anymore, and we're going to, kind of burn the place down, almost that kind of language. And I know some Catholic priests who were involved took exception to some of his language, and they literally, and there's a photograph of it that you have in your book, of them sitting under Lincoln's statue revising that speech. That was kind of
Yeah,
a
so
pivotal moment for him, right?
it's a great story, and I think in the book I have sort of the fullest account of it that's been done. Lewis was a little bit conflicted because on the one hand, he was very much devoted to nonviolence, and he didn't tend to use rhetoric like burn the place down. But he also, as chairman of SNCC, felt that his speech had to reflect his organization's position, which, unlike some of the other groups, they were not so excited about this Kennedy Civil Rights Bill because they were focused on all the things it wasn't doing. And it did leave out a lot. There were a lot of legitimate, important criticisms to make of it. But the first draft is kind of so fiery that it starts with the Archbishop, who doesn't want to give the benediction if this speech is given, but then people in the Justice Department and even King and Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, a lot of the people that John Lewis really looks up to, even they are pressuring him to tone it down. Some of the things that come out are kind of funny. So one line, which wasn't even written by Lewis, says, we're going to march through the South the way Sherman did, which, is not language Lewis would use. And then so Lewis adds, but non-violently, kind of contradicting whatever that sentence was supposed to mean. And Martin Luther King says, John, that doesn't sound like you. And he was right. Lewis hadn't written it. So some of the language is softened, but I think what's telling about the speech, when you read or listen to the speech he actually gives, it's still pretty strong stuff. He's still making criticisms of the Democratic Party, of Kennedy and the bill. It's a little softer in a few places, but he does a pretty deft job, I think, of balancing the need to have a positive, uplifting day that's going to resound in the media as a big success for the movement, while also not pulling his punches too much that he fails to put the criticisms across. And I think, again, it shows at a young age, John Lewis has some political skills that, maybe people weren't fully aware of.
Mm-hmm. And they famously go back to the White House afterwards, and the great photograph standing there with President Kennedy. 2 years later, in Selma, Alabama, in March 1965, was the afternoon, literally, that would define John Lewis for the rest of his life. Describe what happened there.
So there is a planned march from Selma, Alabama to the state capital of Montgomery. For many months now, the people of Selma, largely Black community, has been protesting and organizing for voting rights against, a repressive local government and state government, a sheriff named Jim Clark, who's just kind of sadistic and cruel and, goes after protesters with cattle prods and that kind of thing. And after the death of one young man named, I'm plugging it in, I think Jimmy Lee Jackson, this local movement, which is now being assisted both by King's Group, SCLC, and by SNCC, they're fed up. And so they plan this march. There's some infighting between SCLC and SNCC. Some people want to march, some don't. So John Lewis is marching kind of as an individual, not officially representing SNCC. He's alongside a man named Hosea Williams, representing SCLC. And when they get to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is sort of this humpback little bridge over the Alabama River leading out of town, they encounter, both a sea of Sheriff Clark's posse and then these state troopers, Alabama state troopers. They're told they cannot proceed, they must turn around. John Lewis has them stop and kneel in prayer, at which point they're set upon and beaten, badly beaten. The troopers are riding horses and whipping people as they're up on the horseback. They're hitting them with billy clubs, hitting men, women, elderly people. People are running back to the Brown Chapel, which is kind of like the movement headquarters. Lewis is somehow, in a state he can barely remember, staggers back. I actually found video footage of him in his hospital bed later that afternoon, little seen footage that a photo researcher of mine, Jill Cowan, found. And, it's amazing. In the hospital bed, he's talking to reporters about the importance of nonviolence, after that experience. But it's an experience that's photographed, and there are famous photos of Lewis being beaten on kind of the median strip of the bridge or just off the foot of the bridge. And they're on the front pages of newspapers everywhere the next day. Some of the footage, the film footage is shown on the news that night nationally. It galvanizes the public. It mobilizes Washington. Lyndon Johnson, who has favored a voting rights bill, but not yet. He kind of wanted a little more time after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill before going forward with another big, difficult bill. Now realizes it's time to act. So it's really Lewis's decision to march and then the beating that he takes that forces the passage of the Voting Rights Act later that summer.
And really, from that point on, the movement is in conflict with itself at that point, right? Because famously, the Civil Rights Bill is passed in '64 after Kennedy's death. LBJ gets that done. The Voting Rights Act you just mentioned, and almost immediately, the Voting Rights Act is met with violence in the summer of '65, right? And the Watch riots, famously in Detroit, and the movement kind of changes at that point, in part because what are we now marching for? What is the civil rights movement about now that we can vote? Now that we are allowed to sit down in places? What is happening? And it's at this point that John Lewis receives his ideas of nonviolence come into harsh conflict with Black Power. Stokely Carmichael, this movement, he's ousted. Really, I mean, he's ousted from the presidency of SNCC, and he kind of loses his way for a while.
No, that's right. And, a lot of these tensions between, nonviolence and a more militant approach, between, a more churchy, as they called it, religious orientation and a more kind of secular radical orientation. These had been present in the movement for many years. But so long as they had these common goals, desegregation, voting rights, major legislation, Lewis and other people like James Foreman, who was the executive director of SNCC, could kind of hold it together. So I think it's a combination of both the tensions getting wider as the strains of the 60s, the strains of the times pull it apart, but then also, ironically, the very achievements lead to these open questions of where do we go next. Lewis is kind of lost. He spends a year in New York City working for the Field Foundation, which is funds, civil rights and other projects and organizations. It's kind of fun for him living in New York as a native Alabamian, but not really for him. He's a fish out of water, and going to a desk job, meeting with people on Park Avenue it's not his thing. Um, he then goes to work for the Bobby Kennedy presidential campaign in 1968, and this is kind of the real turn toward politics. He's excited about Kennedy, both as someone he came to see who could learn and grow and become a real ardent advocate for civil rights, but also as an anti-war candidate. Lewis is very much opposed to the Vietnam War and has become a leader in that movement too. But of course, it's just a terrible spring of 1968. He's with Bobby Kennedy when he learns that Martin Luther King has been assassinated. They're in Indianapolis, and Kennedy gives this famous kind of impromptu speech quoting Aeschylus, and talks to Lewis that night, says, of all of us here on this campaign, you were closest to him. And then, of course, 2 months later, John Lewis is in Los Angeles at the Ambassador Hotel when Kennedy himself is then assassinated. And so these events together, following on the very traumatic ouster from SNCC, leave John Lewis really unsure where to turn. And it's at this point in his life that he meets Lillian Miles, who becomes his wife. They'd met a few months earlier, begun dating, and over the summer, Lewis is actually hospitalized for exhaustion, depression. He's just kind of run himself ragged throughout his 20s, and he's now at this low point. Lillian brings him his mail, brings him his newspaper, and very unromantically, he proposes to her. One friend of John Lewis's, who your listeners may know, a Georgia congressman named Buddy Darden, said, you cannot understand the second half of John Lewis's career, this whole second act he had as a politician, without understanding Lillian, because she helped give him the self-confidence to follow his ambitions, to believe he could run for office and be a successful leader. Really, her ambitions for him were limitless, where he often, questioned whether he should put himself out front. She urged him to, helped him believe in himself, and really is a big part of why he did have then this very successful second career as an elected official.
And to that end, I want to, in the interest of time, move us along up to 1986. John Lewis, White's Fowler, is no longer going to run for that fifth congressional district spot, and he and his best friend Julian Bond decide to run against each other. And no secret, it absolutely ruined irreparably their friendship. Lewis was elected, and it set him on the path that really his whole second career of public servant, where we started in talking about this and sort of becoming the moral conscience. But talk for just a minute or two about that Lewis Bond friendship and what happened in that campaign.
It's an amazing chapter of the book, and I can't do full justice to it in just a couple of minutes, but it's almost like that chapter is like a standalone mini drama. They had been close friends since the early 60s. As much as Lewis comes from abject poverty, Bond comes from relative wealth for the Black community. His father's a very acclaimed, celebrated educator. He's met in his youth people like Paul Robeson and Albert Einstein. Bond is dashing and handsome and silver-tongued. And their families were close. They would vacation together, have birthday parties together. So when the seat comes open, both of them think it's kind of their turn. Lewis had come in a creditable second place back in 77 when Fowler won the seat after Andy Young went into the Carter administration. And so Lewis thought, okay, I'll give it another shot. Bond was under the impression they had a deal. Lewis could run once, then the second time it would be Bond's turn. Lewis never remembered such a deal. So, we don't really know. At first, all the smart money is on Bond. The celebrities are lining up. The Temptations are doing fundraisers for him. People like Coretta Scott King, who was quite close to John Lewis, end up, supporting Bond because he's just seen as the face. This is the face that we Atlantans want to represent us in Congress. And John Lewis, again, for all the heroics, wasn't seen as such a major figure at that time. And yet, over the course of the campaign, a couple things happen. One, Lewis just works harder. He's up at dawn. He's at the factory gates. He's at the MARTA stations. He's shaking hands. He's there at dusk in the aisles of the 24-hour convenience stores, seeing who's still up, whose vote he can still get. Then there's also the drug issue. This is the summer of Just Say No, the summer where voters are listing drug use and drug abuse and drug violence as their number one concern. It's sort of an open secret in certain elite Atlanta circles that Julian Bond has a cocaine problem, and it was real and it was serious. And the question is this fair political game? At one point in the race, it's a multi-candidate race that then goes to a runoff. So John Lewis at first doesn't touch the issue. It's another candidate who says we should all take drug tests. And Lewis says, okay, I'll do that. Bond says no. Then it gets down to a two-man runoff. Bond has finished first with something like 47% of the vote. Lewis a distant second, I think 34%, but enough to force the runoff. Bond challenges him to a series of debates, thinking he's going to wipe the floor with him because he's such a better talker, debater, more policy conversant, and all that. Lewis's campaign managers are saying, you've got to introduce this drug issue. And they're sort of waiting for him in the first debate. Lewis can't quite bring himself to bring it up. But in the second debate, Bond lobs a cheap shot at Lewis, and Lewis finally fires back and says, we should both go take a drug test. So this puts the drug issue back at the center of the race. Bond gets indignant. He makes some gaffes, says things like, well, Atlanta doesn't have a drug problem, which everybody knows is absurd. And, in the end, a lot of people are swayed by this. Now, some people say, well, look, this is John Lewis going negative against his best friend. It was a really dirty thing to do, and Lewis did later express regret. But there were other people who said the voters actually do have a right to know if their elected congressman is a drug addict. And that's, it may be personal, it may be unfortunate, but it's fair game. So I try to represent both those positions fairly in the book. Anyway, on election night, the night of the runoff, Lewis stages this dramatic come from behind victory. Bond, I think, gains 1 point going from 47 to 48, while Lewis goes from 34 up to 52. He wins with this interesting coalition of a majority of the white vote and the working class black vote, while Bond tends to get the middle and upper class black vote. So it kind of splits along interesting lines. Was the drug issue decisive? It mattered, but there were a lot of other things that mattered too, including, I think, when people watched those debates, a lot of people said Bond came off as someone who seemed like he was expecting the seat, that he was entitled to it, where Lewis came off as someone who wanted the job to represent you.
Hmm.
And that came through, that his authenticity, his decency, his willingness to work hard, that all came through. And people came to really like that in John Lewis and admire that in John Lewis.
And he went on and served until his death, literally 34 years as the congressman from the 5th District. It was from that platform that he became the moral conscience of the Congress. He led pilgrimages back to Selma on the anniversary and took congressmen with him, bipartisan delegations through the Bush years and through the Obama presidencies. It's a remarkable story. And I also wanted to get you to comment on, too, the other thing that John Lewis did. He was an early advocate and was committed to gay rights. Even in this mid 80s, when fear of AIDS was exploding, he spoke out and said, "Who you love is your business and it should be your right."
It's really quite impressive. As early as, I think, 1981, I found on city council, he
Hmm.
is being outspoken for gay rights at a time when, many liberal Democrats, black politicians really don't want to go there.
Hmm.
Andy Young, who later would be a big supporter of gay rights, he's mayor. He instead of having Gay Pride Day, he has something called Human Rights Day. A lot of people are afraid, and Lewis is quite out in front and ahead of the curve, even for liberal politicians.
Yeah, at times he seems almost too good to be true. If he hadn't really done all of this, we could talk for another hour about the years following that and his strong commitment to equality and voting rights right up until the very end. Your description of his death and the final weeks and months of his life, and literally that day, moved me to tears. It is quite moving. I don't normally say this, David, but I see a Pulitzer here. I mean, this is it's a fantastic book, and I cannot recommend it enough. Your publisher is Simon and Schuster, and I know that was there any hesitation on their part to publish a biography of this civil rights icon?
No, they were very excited to sign me up. It was my first book with them, and my editor told me, when he saw my proposal, the first thing he did was kind of race to the internet to make sure there wasn't another Lewis biography. He was
Hmm.
kind of astonished that there wasn't, as I had been. So they were very keen on publishing the book. They've done great civil rights books in the past. Simon Schuster published Taylor Branch's
Hmm.
famous trilogy and
Hmm.
David Blight's great biography of Frederick Douglass. So I feel I'm in good hands with them. And yeah, I'll just say we sort of passed over, as inevitably is the case, sort of these later years. But
Mm.
I think one thing I've tried to accomplish in the book also is to tell in some detail and also some drama those congressional years, his relationships with Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, George Bush plays a surprising role in
Hmm.
some of the
Hmm.
things that Lewis gets him to support.
He goes
Um,
to Selma,
yeah,
right?
he
20.
comes
Yeah.
along to Selma on the trip. He supports the creation of the Smithsonian African American History and Culture Museum.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there's a lot about those congressional years too that I think
Oh yeah.
we'll find exciting, even if we can
Oh,
only touch
yeah,
on them
we
right
we could do
now.
that in part two of this podcast. Absolutely. There's so much we couldn't cover. It is a thorough cradle to grave biography, but it never bogs down. It just you cover all the points. The book is John Lewis, A Life published by Simon & Schuster. The last question I want to ask you, David, is did you at any point get anybody who questioned you or pushed back about this white historian writing this life of this black icon?
Not a one. It was really kind of amazing. A lot of people ask me that question in the manner you have. Are there other people out there who objected? But, I interviewed, I think, something like 275 people. I wasn't counting, but maybe half more were black people. No, they were all excited to talk about John Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
He himself, family members, staff, many African Americans were very supportive and enthusiastic. And I think, look, the work of a historian or biographer is intrinsically about getting to know someone in another time or place or skin color or region or religion who's going to be different from you. And it's that act of what historians sometimes call sympathetic imagination or imaginative sympathy that is what we strive to do. Now, you can do it well or you can do it not so well, but you try your best. And I do feel that whatever elements of leading a life as a black person that I can never fully understand, I do feel like I've gotten to know John Lewis, better than I know many actual acquaintances of my own. You study someone for 5 years, listen to their words, them speaking every day, watching video, reading their texts, talking to their friends. You get to know someone, and then you try to convey that in what you put on the page. And I hope people feel I've done justice to the life of John Lewis.
I don't think there's any doubt that you have. It is a remarkable book. I cannot commend it and recommend it enough. It's called John Lewis, A Life, published by Simon & Schuster. The author is David Greenberg. David, thank you so much for giving of your time to talk about this remarkable man and your book.
Thank you, Stan. It's great to talk with you. Really enjoyed it.
My thanks to David Greenberg for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at simonschuster.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the GHS Giant Pumpkin Kayaking team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The GHS Director of Accounts Payable is Bill Schroeder. Our Chief Accountant is Candace B. Rittenoff. Our Airline Reservation Manager is Will Price Randomly. The Off the Beaten Path Stock Market Predictor is Luigi Board. Our Director of Employee Loyalty is Upton Leftis. The Conductor of the GHS Symphony Orchestra is Philip Harmonic. Our Staff Layoff Specialist is Harry Verderci, assisted by Layoff Counselor Oscar LaVista. The GHS Staff Physicist is Mo Mintum. Our Insurance Claim Liaison is Royal Payne Diaz. Our Customer Care Specialist is Begonia Payne Diaz. Our Complaints Coordinator is Stella Payne Diaz. Our IRS Liaison is Major Payne Diaz. The Manager of the GHS Membership Refund Program is Wendy Pigs Fly. Our in-house Literary Critic is Al Lagori. The official Off the Beaten Path Holiday Decorations Specialist is Aretha Holly. The GHS Holiday Wardrobe Consultant is Don Wienow. Our Staff Director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iappoca. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff. And our Off the Beaten Path Martini Mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. Be sure to follow and like and share, please. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Please also visit deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out dispatches from Off the Beaten Path, my blog, and similar Good Trouble podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.